You know, uh, you know that incredibly specific feeling when you are working on a massive jigsaw puzzle, like one of those 1,000-piece ones?
Oh, yeah. The ones that just completely take over your dining room table for weeks.
Exactly. You spend days, I mean, maybe even weeks, hunched over it. You painstakingly sort the edge pieces. You color code the middle sections based on, like, those microscopic differences in the sky.
Right, the worst part.
Yeah. And then you are finally down to the very last gap on the board. So you reach into the box for that final piece of cardboard, and your hand just hits the bottom. The box is empty. That final piece is just gone. Sucked into the vacuum cleaner, eaten by the dog, who knows?
That is genuinely agonizing.
It really is. And your brain absolutely cannot handle the fact that this beautiful landscape image you have been working on is incomplete. So what do?
I mean, you improvise, right?
You completely improvise. You grab a random scrap of cardboard, you sketch out the missing part of the sky with a blue ballpoint pen, color it in, and you just jam it into the hole.
Even though it looks terrible.
Right. It doesn't match perfectly, the edges are rough, but you do it anyway. You do it simply so you don't have to look at that agonizing, unresolved gap staring back at you.
Well, it's a profoundly human impulse to do that. And we do it whether with puzzles or with actual information.
Yeah.
We're fundamentally wired to be uncomfortable with the unknown.
Especially when it comes to patterns, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
particularly with patterns. We are curious creatures who desperately want to figure out the whys and the hows of the world around us. So when we encounter a gap in our knowledge, that exact same psychological itch kicks in. We just crave a complete picture.
And we pull this exact same cardboard puzzle piece trick with the language we use every single day.
We really do.
Which is why today we are taking a deep dive into a stack of linguistic and historical sources to track down the origin of a phrase you have probably used, 100 times.
Yeah.
We are talking about the phrase piece of cake.
Yes, a classic.
Our mission here is to sift through the historical record and figure out where those three words actually came from when used to describe something easy. And, well, spoiler alert for you listening, it is a shockingly elusive mystery.
Oh, it is an absolute labyrinth of a linguistic cold case. And there is actually an academic framework for this puzzle-fixing behavior you're talking about. In linguistics, we refer to it as folk etymology.
Folk etymology, okay.
Right. So when we don't have documented, undeniable proof of where a word or an idiom originated, humans generally refuse to just let the mystery sit there. A linguistic vacuum makes us really uneasy.
We hate the empty space.
Exactly. So culturally, we just invent a backstory. We piece together a plausible history based on whatever context clues are floating around. We wrap it in a neat little narrative bow, and then society collectively agrees to just accept it as the truth.
Okay, let's unpack this, because piece of cake serves as the ultimate poster child for folk etymology.
It really does.
It perfectly illustrates how far we will go to fill a gap because, as our sources clearly lay out, trying to uncover why we say piece of cake to mean an effortless task is, well, it's anything but easy.
No, not at all. And to understand the mechanics of this mystery, we have to start by looking at an entirely different but supposedly related idiom.
Okay, where are we starting?
Well, if you open up a browser right now and search for the origin of piece of cake, the algorithm is almost certainly going to point you toward another phrase that carries the exact same meaning, which is the cakewalk.
Oh, right. Because if a task is simple, you might tell a coworker it's a piece of cake, or you might tell them it's going to be a cakewalk.
Yes, they are basically linguistic twins.
The two phrases are used interchangeably in modern conversations, sitting right alongside things like easy as pie or a walk in the park. But diving into the source material, the origin story of the cakewalk is completely split.
Very much so.
It exists in two entirely different realities. There is the modern suburban iteration, and then there's a much deeper, really complex historical iteration.
Right, and when I review the modern sources detailing what a cakewalk looks like today, it paints a very specific, very low-stakes picture.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you walk into a modern middle school gymnasium for a community fundraiser or like a church fair, a cakewalk is essentially just a relaxed game of musical chairs.
Just walking in a circle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But instead of the anxiety of getting eliminated when the music starts, you're just casually walking around a circle of taped numbers on the floor. The music stops, you freeze on a number.
And if you're lucky, you win.
Right. If the announcer calls your number, you walk away with a baked good.
Yeah.
Usually there's a whole table of donated cakes brought in as prizes.
Sounds pretty effortless.
Totally. In that specific modern context, it is, quite literally, a zero-skill, entirely luck-based way to win a cake. the effort is minimal. So drawing a straight line from that modern game to a phrase meaning an incredibly easy task feels like, just common sense.
The superficial logic certainly tracks, but that modern fundraiser game is a heavily sanitized, heavily detached evolution of what the term originally meant.
Right. It goes way further back.
Historically, a cakewalk wasn't a game of chance at a school fair. Our sources highlight that the cakewalk was a highly specific, highly choreographed type of dance.
An actual dance.
Yes. It gained massive cultural popularity during the Reconstruction era following the American Civil War, largely popularized by African-American performers.
And the roots of that performance stretch back much further into some, honestly, incredibly dark chapters of American history.
They do. And the broader context here completely shifts the tone of the phrase. Passed down oral histories and cultural accounts suggest this dance was performed well before the Reconstruction era by enslaved people on southern plantations.
Oh, okay.
The enslaved individuals would dress in whatever formal wear they could acquire and perform these grandiose, highly exaggerated promenades. And the entire purpose of this performance was deeply subversive.
It was like a physical satire, right?
Exactly. It was a physical satire designed to actively mock the white slave owners. The performers were parodying the rigid, overly formal, and pretentious ways the wealthy plantation class would walk, bow, and dance at their elite gatherings.
Right.
And the most skilled performance, the couple that delivered the sharpest, most biting satirical movement, was awarded a prize. And that prize was a cake.
Okay, wait a minute. Hold on. This is exactly where the source material's logic starts breaking down for me. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Go for it.
If this dance was a highly skilled, intensely physical performance that required rhythm, coordination, and the ability to execute complex satirical movements, a dance that eventually became massively popular not just in America but across European stages and even served as a foundational precursor to ragtime music.
Right.
How in the world does that translate to something being easy?
This raises an important question, and you are zeroing in on the exact contradiction that makes this a classic folk etymology.
It just doesn't fit.
It really doesn't. When we try to link the effortless nature of a piece of cake to the historical reality of the cakewalk, we crash into two major historical flaws. The first is a profound lack of primary source documentation regarding its origins.
Meaning we don't have a definitive starting point.
We don't have first-hand written accounts from the individuals who supposedly invented it during the slavery era. We rely on oral traditions and passed down stories regarding the original intent of these plantation performances.
Which makes pinning down facts really tough.
Exactly. The documentation is so scarce that historians actively debate the actual genesis of the dance.
Right, and we should be clear about what the sources say here.
Yes, we're just reporting what's in the historical debate. There's a school of thought arguing that the enslaved population developed the satirical dance entirely on their own.
Okay.
However, there's another historical theory suggesting that white slave owners originally invented a derogatory, mocking version of a dance to demean the enslaved population.
And then what happened?
Well, according to that theory, the enslaved population subversively adapted it, flipped the script, and made it their own to mock the owners back.
Got it. So the foundational history is built on some heavily debated, unrecorded ground.
Precisely. Trying to pin an etymological origin to it is incredibly risky.
And beyond the missing historical paperwork, the second flaw just defies basic common sense.
It's the physical reality of the dance itself. Dancing a traditional, competitive cakewalk was exhausting.
It was a workout.
A massive one. It demanded intense physical endurance and precise body control. If you consider how physically and mentally demanding that satire was, trying to link the word cakewalk, or its supposed derivative, piece of cake, to a task that requires absolutely no effort makes zero logical sense.
The metaphor completely collapses under its own weight.
It does.
It's kind of like, the equivalent of calling a really easy math test an Olympic decathlon. It fundamentally misrepresents what the original thing actually was.
That's a great way to put it.
The American cakewalk theory is just riddled with these massive logical holes. We found that missing gap in our linguistic puzzle.
What?
And we've been trying to force this complex American dance history into the space simply because the word cake is involved in both.
Right.
But it doesn't fit the shape of the whole.
The edges are entirely wrong. And when the logic fails in one area, historians are forced to look elsewhere. The sources guide our search across the Atlantic Ocean because when we analyze the geographical footprint of the phrase piece of cake, the data tells a vastly different story than the American cakewalk theory.
This brings us to the transatlantic plot twist, which is easily my favorite part of this deep dive.
Oh, it's so good.
There is a massive, glaring geographic discrepancy in the historical record. The cakewalk, both the physical dance and the term itself, is a uniquely American invention.
Completely homegrown.
Right. It was born in the United States and only began to cross over to European awareness much later through traveling minstrel shows and cultural exports. But historically, when we search for the phrase piece of cake, meaning an easy task, it shows up far more regularly and far earlier in England.
Which should immediately cast doubt for anyone trying to connect the two.
Right.
Because if piece of cake was truly a natural evolution of the American cakewalk, the earliest and most frequent documented uses of the phrase would undeniably be clustered in the United States. You would see it in American newspapers, American novels, American letters.
But the archives do not show that. Not at all. The smoking gun buried in our sources is this incredibly bizarre literary quirk from the year 1936.
Yes.
The very first definitively written instance of the phrase piece of cake that historians have on record doesn't come from an American newspaper describing a dance. It's found in a book of light poetry called Primrose Path. It was written by an incredibly famous author named Ogden Nash.
And the irony here is that Ogden Nash was, in fact, an American writer.
He was. Which, at first glance, you would think supports the American origin theory. You think, an American wrote it first.
Right, but
this is the anomaly that actually dismantles the entire American theory. Ogden Nash wrote this particular poem, and in the original United States edition of his book, the line in question goes exactly like this. Her picture's in the paper now, and everything is Jake.
That last word is the linchpin of this entire investigation. Jake.
Yeah, Jake. And to be clear for you listening, he wasn't referring to a guy named Jake.
No, definitely not.
In 1930s America, Jake was a very common piece of slang that simply meant everything is fine, everything is okay, or everything is easy. You'd say, don't worry about it, everything is Jake.
But the publishing industry operates on clarity and marketability. When you take an American book filled with hyper-specific American slang and try to sell it overseas to a British audience, you run into an immediate translation wall.
Right, they wouldn't get it.
Exactly. The British readers picking up Nash's poetry in 1936 would have stared at the word Jake in total confusion. It wasn't part of their cultural lexicon at all. Leaving it in would disrupt the rhythm of the poem and completely obscure the meaning for the international market.
So the British publishers took out their red pens and actively altered the poem for the UK edition. They had a very specific set of requirements to fix this line.
Very strict requirements.
Yeah, they needed something that maintained the meter of the poem, they needed a phrase that rhymed perfectly with the previous lines, and most importantly, they needed a domestic idiom that their British audience would instantly recognize as meaning everything is fine and effortless.
Right.
So they crossed out everything is Jake and replaced it with life's a piece of cake.
What's fascinating here is the editorial mechanics behind that choice. Think about the fundamental goal of a publisher. They want to remove friction for the reader. If a British editor in 1936 actively selected the phrase piece of cake, specifically to translate a confusing piece of foreign slang into something instantly recognizable,
then the phrase piece of cake had to have already been a deeply established everyday idiom in the United Kingdom.
Exactly.
I mean, you don't try to clarify confusing foreign slang by inventing a brand new piece of confusing local slang. You translate it into a cliche that everyone from the milkman to the prime minister already implicitly understands.
And the timeline completely supports that assumption. If it was already an ingrained British idiom by 1936, the theory that it spun off from an American dance becomes highly improbable.
Almost impossible.
The phrase had to have been percolating in British culture for years, if not decades, before that editor decided to use it as a patch for Ogden Nash's poem.
And the cultural adoption of the phrase gets even more distinctly British from there. As we move forward just a few years in the timeline, the sources show us that by the outbreak of World War II, the British Royal Air Force had adopted the phrase as a core part of their military slang.
The RAF pilots.
Yeah, RAF pilots were routinely using piece of cake over their radios and in their debriefings to describe an easy bombing target or a flying mission where they encountered zero enemy resistance.
The contrast there is striking, and it explains why military slang so often appropriates domestic phrases.
How so?
Well, you have fighter pilots operating in incredibly high-stress life-or-death environments over the skies of Europe. To cope with that immense psychological pressure, they employ extreme understatement.
Ah, I see.
Applying a phrase that evokes the safety, comfort, and domestic ease of having a slice of cake in a British parlor to the terrifying reality of a combat mission is a classic psychological defense mechanism. By the early 1940s, piece of cake is universally understood across the British military.
But this is exactly where the thrilling historical chase comes to a screeching halt.
Sadly, yes.
We know it was a staple of British culture by the 1930s and heavily utilized by the military in the 40s. But if you try to dig deeper into the British archives to find records of everyday citizens using the phrase before that 1936 publishing edit, I mean, if you look for who said it first or what specific cake they were talking about,
The trail just evaporates.
it is a total impenetrable dead end. The historical paper trail comes up completely empty. Earlier records are practically non-existent. And eventually, the timeline just stops. There's no origin point.
None at all.
There is no patient zero who coined the phrase piece of cake. Which brings us to the most frustrating but perhaps the most illuminating part of this entire deep dive. We have successfully dismantled the logical seamlessness of the American cakewalk theory. We have proven it was a British staple, only to hit a massive brick wall in the British historical archives.
The true origin of the cake is quite literally lost to history.
We just have to throw our hands up and embrace the unknown here. As the sources point out, there simply isn't enough surviving documentation to know the truth. Could it somehow be a bizarre mutation of the cakewalk? It's possible. Maybe the word cakewalk traveled to Europe, mutated in the public consciousness into piece of cake, and then inexplicably became vastly more popular in England than in the country that invented it. Or maybe the two phrases have absolutely zero connection to each other whatsoever. Maybe cakewalk is strictly American, piece of cake is strictly British, and we humans just forcefully smashed the two concepts together through sheer force of will because they both happen to involve the word cake, and we desperately wanted them to be related.
We grabbed that metaphorical scrap of cardboard, drew a piece of cake on it, and jammed it into the historical gap because the void was too uncomfortable to look at.
So what does this all mean for us? If the neat, tidy history we've been telling ourselves about where our language comes from is probably just a collective hallucination, was this whole deep dive just a frustrating waste of time?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, absolutely not.
Oh.
This deep dive reveals something essential about human cognition and psychology. Even if a FERC etymology is entirely fabricated, even if it is demonstrably factually incorrect, the existence of that theory isn't meaningless.
I need you to elaborate on that, because right now it feels a little bit like we're just giving ourselves permission to accept a lie.
We aren't validating the lie. We are examining the psychological drive that created the lie in the first place.
Okay, go on.
The relentless desire to find patterns, to establish causality, to find links in our language and our shared history is a fundamental pillar of what makes us human. We are incredibly complex, meaning-making machines.
Right, we can't help ourselves.
Exactly. When we look at the world and see a gap in our knowledge, our immediate, unavoidable instinct is to build a bridge over it. We want order, we want narrative. And theories like the cakewalk connection, regardless of their factual accuracy, are incredibly valuable artifacts of that human desire.
Because the act of trying to figure it out keeps us engaged with our own culture.
Precisely. The value isn't always in finding the correct answer. The value is in the habit of questioning.
Yeah.
Investigating these folk etymologies forces us to think critically about our environment. It forces us to slow down, look at the literal words coming out of our own mouths and ask, wait a second, why do I actually say that? Where did that concept originate?
It transforms language from a passive, invisible tool that we just blindly utilize into an active, living history that we are participating in and interrogating.
Exactly. The search itself sharpens our critical thinking. It teaches us to evaluate evidence just like we did with the Ogden Nash poem and the timeline of British slang, rather than just accepting the first, clean, easy narrative that a search engine spits out.
It's the intellectual journey that matters, not necessarily the destination.
And that journey makes us better, more discerning consumers of information in every aspect of our lives.
So, to summarize this wild transatlantic journey we've been on today, we started with a very simple quest to define why we use 3 specific words to say a task is easy.
A seemingly simple quest.
Right. And that quest took you, the listener, from the squeaky gymnasium floors of modern luck-based school fundraisers, all the way back to the deeply subversive, physically grueling promenades of enslaved peoples mocking their oppressors.
And then across the ocean.
Yes. Then the logic failed, and the clues threw us across the ocean into the editing room of a 1930s British publishing house, desperately trying to translate American slang, and finally into the high-stakes cockpits of WWII fighter pilots using domestic comfort to cope with the horrors of war. All of that incredibly rich human history, just to try and explain the phrase, piece of cake.
It is a massive, sprawling cultural footprint for such an unassuming little idiom.
It really is. And it leaves me with one final kind of mind-bending thought to leave you with today as you go about your week.
Oh, what's that?
Think about the language you're using right now. Think about the hyper-specific slang, the weird inside jokes, the bizarre idioms you and your friends or your colleagues use every single day in your text threads and your group chats.
The stuff that only you guys understand.
Exactly. Now imagine 150 years from now, when we are all long gone and all the original context of your group chats and your TikTok references is completely lost to time. What wild, elaborate, and totally incorrect folk etymologies will the linguists of the year 2150 invent to explain what you were talking about?
Wow.
When they look at the fragmented archives of our era, what fake puzzle pieces will they draw to make sense of us?
It's a fascinating perspective. We are actively creating tomorrow's historical mysteries today.
We absolutely are. Something to mull over the next time you drop a weird phrase into conversation and someone asks you what it means. Thanks for joining us as we try to fill in the missing pieces one deep dive at a time.